Next, Martin Mann discusses and debates philosophical and ethical topics with his guests on The Open Forum. Hello, this is The Open Forum. I am your host today, Martin Mann. Today I'm discussing Is Journalism Dead? My guests today are Dr. Taylor, who teaches senior English journalism, is the advisor of Junto, and recently completed his doctoral dissertation on American journalism. Andrew Yu, an editor for Junto and Chuanlong. Jonathan Volstek, an editor for Ambrosia. And Sauman Cheng, my co-host. So today, our topic is journalism dead? Mr. Taylor, I believe, since you have just written your dissertation on this, perhaps you should start us off in our discussion.
Okay, so I would say my dissertation wasn't exactly directly answering this question, but nonetheless, I'd say we're in a paradoxical situation where people basically make a kind of bipolar argument. So there are those who argue quite forcefully that journalism is, if not dead, dying, and there's a fair bit of evidence for that. Most of it economic. Daily newspapers are collapsing around the world, but especially in the U.S. The kinds of journalism that are rising to replace them tend to be very bad at gathering basic facts. So there are bloggers who are great writers, but they're very, very limited in the kind of reporting they can do because they're just individuals without institutional support, etc. There are, though, people who make exactly the opposite case, that we are, in fact, living in a golden era of journalism. And one of the people who makes that case is named Robert Boynton. He's a professor of journalism at NYU and has written a really influential book called The New Journalists. And Boynton argues that we live in an era where there's been a kind of liberation from corporate mold of journalism. So there was a day when the way to be a journalist was you had a job at NBC or you had a job at the New York Times, and there are certain conventions of writing you must adhere to. But that today we're liberated from those conventions so that you see many more books of long-form journalism published that do stylistic things that would never be allowed in the pages of the New York Times. You see bloggers expressing views that would never be allowed in the New York Times, documentary filmmakers covering topics that would never be covered by establishment journalists, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are the two poles of the debate, and they're quite extreme poles today. That journalism in one sense of the term is all but dead. Journalism in another sense of the term is flourishing. So I don't know, thoughts? Would anyone like to weigh in on one pole or the other?
I feel like sometimes there's a generalization made about journalism that it's written. It's mostly written like either on internet sources or on established journalism like newspapers and magazines. But when you think of documentaries and blogging, that type of journalism is flourishing so much. So I think I would agree with the new journalist theory.
I mean, just to add to that, when you start to think about the different forms of journalism available, I read recently a pretty good article that was sent to me by noted improv comedian Thomas Ruin about the way Occupy Wall Street has been covered. Yeah, and it made the point that I want to say anybody, but of course I mean anybody with a first world amount of money can have a video recording device, can record 5 minutes of what the police are doing and post it to a website. And that is a kind of journalism. It's unfiltered, it's often not framed very well and taken out of context, but it is a kind of journalism so that we have audio and video footage available of almost everything that happens in the world today in a way that wasn't true even 10 years. Well, that's an exaggeration. Yeah, even 10 years ago, because you wouldn't have had the internet streaming ability to do that.
So, I think there's a famous New York Times columnist named James Soroki.
New Yorker.
New Yorker. Sorry, New Yorker. And he expresses a similar idea in a TED Talk that he made about covering the East Asian tsunami, about he was talking about how it was in reality really grassroots journalism all combined together to become like a single coverage of an event, but it was basically everybody contributing their perspective of it. And I think in a sense that's kind of true. I think it's maybe the death of institutionalized journalism, in the sense that not maybe a death or decline, maybe that the New York Times as by themselves, and New York Times actually and the AP, such as the AP, them having people report on incidents is not also often as important as people who are there on the scene right there who can contribute to a story.
But is the argument does real, like, true journalism need an institution? I mean, one of the polls that you mentioned, Ms. Taylor, seem to argue that journalism requires that institution to legitimize it, and that if it is grassroots, or if the people, the public, take a video, that's perhaps just recording it and reporting it, and not actual journalism. Is there a sense of that journalism is somehow perhaps an art form, or something that is higher than merely recording an event?
So I tend to take the internet is bunk side of this debate whenever possible. Yeah, and completely disagree with Sir Wicky's argument, because he's making an argument that in aggregate, the coverage of the Asian tsunami was quite comprehensive and impressive and provided diversity of perspectives that no one institution could have done. The problem is that Sir Wiki is paid a lot of money to do nothing but read the internet all day if he so chooses, and so he can consume the internet in aggregate. Most readers can't do that, and they rely on an institution to filter that information and contextualize it for them. So it could be that over the course of reading 200 separate blogs, I would get a pretty accurate sense of the latest Republican primary or something, but I'm not going to do that, and I doubt very many people are. And so I rely on these professionals to do it for me, and I think that the death of those institutions is a problem.
I mean, to some degree, I think I would agree, but not entirely, because maybe less people, say, read newspapers, but these institutions we refer to doesn't mean they're gone. It's just so much of what they do now, especially like the minute-to-minute, up-to-date news, it goes on the internet, straight on the internet. I mean, that's where I always get my news.
I mean, that's true, but it's also an undeniable fact that the number of reporters employed by marquee institutions is in stark decline.
But maybe that's because you don't need that many people anymore, because they don't actually write articles, send them in, etc. Just, you don't need that many people to cover everything.
Possible, but I'm skeptical, because it also involves closing a lot of bureaus. So a lot of news organizations now just say, like, we're going to have one Middle East bureau, where we used to have someone in Damascus and someone in Cairo and someone in, Jerusalem. And so I think that does become a problem, because, no one person can have all the contacts he or she needs, etc., in all those places. So, and I think also the argument that, we can do it more efficiently does smack a bit of, like, profit maximization.
Well, I kind of agree with that, because in a sense, your argument is almost an oversimplification of the industry, almost, in a sense, because you're suggesting that that due to, I guess, technological advances and that sort, that we're able to cut down on the number of people, but in the end, the amount that one person can physically write and cover is limited. So even with technology, one person can only do so much, and you still need a X number of people to cover it. Such as, like, you can't have one group covering the Middle East. You probably need a group in different areas, especially if it's something that's so newsworthy, such as, like, events in the Middle East.
Okay, so perhaps the question is, because I'm not strongly for our side, why is this happening then? If you think it is happening, is there no longer any demand for that kind of institutionalized formal journalism? Because if there is, then why is it going away? And
I don't think the whole institutionalized journalism is really going away. Perhaps what's going away is the print journalism. And of course, a lot of newspapers and news sources are going online, and people go on that daily. I go on BBC daily for news, and I don't read hundreds of blogs to get my news sources. I mean, but is there a sense that anywhere that non-written paper journalism is any less credible, and that web institutionalized journalism is less credible than the printed source?
I mean, that's a good question, and there's okay, I think there's two responses to that. One, the first would be no, that the medium of dissemination is not particularly important, but just because of the history we've inherited, the trustworthy organizations that have credible and accredited bureaus all over the world tend to be print journalism sources, whereas Yahoo News does not have those things and seems to have no interest in creating them. Though there are some exceptions. I mean, Bloomberg News does a good job, and that's basically an internet-era creation. The other response is that there is an argument to be made that some forms of journalism are better than other forms of journalism, all right? And this is the more controversial position to take. So the argument goes like this. If I'm sitting here looking at a broadsheet-sized newspaper, page of a newspaper, I may read one thing on that page. I'm unlikely to read every word on it. So I'll pick the story over here. Sauman will read the story over here. Andrew might not read that page at all. He might go to the financial section or whatever. That's possible with a newspaper. When you talk about televised journalism, right, you don't have that option. If you have a television show, you need everyone's eyeballs to see every story because someone can't just skip to the next story. And so the argument is that any format of journalism that basically relies on video like that, you can't run a story that's only interesting to 1% of your audience, and so you end up running things that are only lowest common denominator, appealing to everyone. So you'll run maybe one big political story, but you're not going to run something that's, maybe a particular fascination to the people of Iowa, but nowhere else. You see what I mean? So that, the web is like a different story that way because, like say CNN.com can actually blend both now, where they can have basically broadcast journalism, but it's embedded in one link on a page, so you might just watch that story or not. So it's a bit more messy now. But there always was an argument that print was inherently better than TV and radio for that reason.
Well, I think that print journalism is inevitably going to disappear, especially with the rise of electronics. Everything will be electronic. So what will be relied on will be those institutions of journalism, like CNN, BBC, that have a reputation of, good journalism. And I think there's a decline in that now because of the interest demand, because journalism is they still have to cater to a demand. Like, people demand news and they have interests. And so the way many stories are shaped, or the news is shaped, is to cater to that demand. And I think there's a decline in that now because with the huge access of the internet, then people can pick and choose what they're interested in, and a lot of it is just frou-frou nonsense news. And that may be construed as journalism dying.
And surely a lot of the people reporting, like a lot of the public reports of events, come to us through these institutions, and we see clips of uprisings in Syria, or on CNN they have the I reports, and surely those come through us through the institutions. So is that where we are heading? Perhaps for the institutions to do the aggregating and the sorting of the news from those the people who report to them, and so that they both get the wide coverage and the first person view, but also the consumers get the filtered, distilled version.